I'm Financial Investigations Correspondent at BBC News. But a few years ago, I used to present a show, an early morning show called Wake Up to Money through the financial crisis. And afterwards, and I've been informed that I had the great privilege of Tom listening to me in the shower every morning as he got up. So Tom, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for putting some clothes on. I just want to give you a sense of Tom and his background and why you came to found this Centre for Financial Security. You were 20 years at JP Morgan, weren't you? And what was it in that experience that led you to think this was necessary?
Well, I'd like to say that having been in the shower for 8 years, I needed an excuse to get up a bit later in the morning. But so I only ever asked JP Morgan for two things. One was to take a sabbatical to go study at King's College, London, which is where I did my master's and where I came across this whole idea of finance and security and financial intelligence. And the second was to fire me and make me redundant when I decided that actually I'd had enough at JP Morgan and I'd quite like to leave. So I didn't really know what I was doing, to be honest with you. I mean, the main thing that happened was after my master's, I went back to JP Morgan for a year, which was the deal. And my boss at the time, at the end of my year back there, said, look, you know, you've always wanted to go and work in Hong Kong. There's a big job on the horizon. Commit for 3 years. We'll make you, wildly wealthy. Or, perceptive guy that he was, I get a feeling your mind is somewhere else. And my mind was somewhere else, because during that year after my master's, so we're talking about 2013, I was getting various phone calls from people that I'd met during my master's dissertation research, which had been on terrorist financing, and they were saying things like, there's this thing Al-Qaeda in Iraq, there's this thing ISIS bubbling up, and you're that banking chap who seems to be interested in security, why don't you do something useful with yourself? So I called their bluff, and I left. And I came to a conference, and I sat just over there, next to a gentleman called Donald Toon, who many of you will probably know, who was about to start, I think, at the National Crime Agency as director of the Economic Crime Command. And by the end of the morning, I realized, well, it's a mess. Someone needs to fix it.
And what did your thesis on terrorist financing tell you? What sort of insight did that give you?
Well, I wrote in 10,000 words what Juan Zarate wrote in 100,000 words, but he became famous and made money out of his book. And I won the dissertation prize at King's. So I think what it told me was, it's where I started to open my eyes and realize that there is all this information in the private sector. There is all this capability in the private sector. And we've got a security community who are trying their best, but actually they're not, pardon the phrase, but milking that system for what it's worth. And I think the fact that people were trying to figure out how Islamic State was moving money around the world, obviously there had been all the post-9/11 work on Al-Qaeda's finances, which had opened people's eyes. I mean, if you're interested in finance and security and you haven't read the 9/11 Commission's monograph on the financial dimension of that, then you're missing the foundation of this story. $500,000 flowed through the US or through the international banking system. So if you don't understand the intersection of finance and security, then frankly you're missing out, and that's what really fascinated me.
You asked me on because I'm a journalist. You wanted my hardball questions as well as the soft questions. So two of the sponsors here, HSBC, yep. Standard Chartered. Yep. I recently did an article about how Standard Chartered among its clients were organisations which have since been linked with terrorist financing. It was fined, as well as HSBC, in 2012, just before you were starting all this. And some of the supporters, Stuart Gulliver, who was the boss of HSBC, who spent a lot of time in Washington trying to avoid HSBC getting prosecuted. How did that all feed into the start of this?
So when I went back to JP Morgan after my sabbatical, JP Morgan was under a consent order. So JP Morgan was heading the same way as every bank at that time. And there was a huge mission internally to try and understand what is going wrong. And I think, to be honest, the banking system was flying blind, you could say, during that sort of post 2000 period. And I remember there are only 2 or 3 things I remember about compliance in my 20 years at JP Morgan. And I was sitting on the floor every day, ringing people up and trying to get them to do deals. So compliance was a pain in the arse, pardon my French, right? It got in the way. And I can remember, there are 2 things that I remember. The first was the head of compliance, who I had no idea who that person was for probably the first 15 years of my time at the bank, came to London and looked us all in the eyes and said, it's very simple. If you don't do what you're meant to do, you will lose every dime that you have made in profit over the last however long your career is, and you will lose your reputation. So point 1, that went in my head. The second thing, which was critical in my experience, was that compliance had been, you could circumvent compliance, bluntly. The head of compliance was somebody who you went to your boss and said, I really want to do this deal, and he'd go, yeah, business decision, crack on, right? That was taken out of the equation. So in that sort of period, in the sort of mid-2000s, we went from not having to think about these things, if we chose to, I hasten to add I always thought about it, of course, to actually having to think about this and to realize that what we did had consequences beyond the bottom line. So, I'm sure at some point JP Morgan was fined. Obviously, the seminal moment were the big fines that caught the headlines. But believe you me, we were all under massive pressure. And I think that the one thing that I would I say to policymakers is, we heard about Kinge's children earlier on. The bottom line is the banking system has gone from needing to be taught lessons to, I think, now being much more of a partner than something that needs to be taught lessons. There are other industries that clearly need to go on that journey. We see that in the case of the Russia sanctions. So, I think that we were funded by HSBC and Standard Chartered when we first started. It was very valuable, and we wouldn't be what we are today if it weren't for the vision of people like Stuart Gulliver and John Cusack and Bill Winters and co. at the time. So the industry's grown up.
But at the same time, Stuart Gulliver was there, John Cusack was there. I don't doubt their integrity, but when their organisations were doing things like putting a dot and a dash in the middle of the names of the organisations, the sanctioned entities, in order that the transactions wouldn't be caught by the system. And this was, as you say, how do you distinguish between perceiving compliance and anti-money laundering as the anti-business department, getting in the way of the normal run of business and the bonuses, etc.? How do you distinguish between that and a failure to make a determined effort to prevent money laundering?
It's about culture, full stop. It's about culture. If you remember, after the financial crisis in the UK, there was something set up called, I think, the Banking Standards Board or something like that, which basically did this big investigation into the culture in these organisations. And it's about changing culture, and it's about leadership. So, at JP Morgan, we had leadership in the form of Bill Winters and Jamie Dimon, who basically, if you put profit first, your next step was out of the door. Right? The reason that JP Morgan went through the financial crisis so successfully, I remember it vividly. We were all managing directors. We were put in the basement where the restaurant was, the kitchen was, and essentially the doors were locked in true JP Morgan himself fashion. And basically it was like, look, you need to understand that if you want to do the business that the person talking, thinks is too risky, then go join Bear Stearns, go join Merrill Lynch, because we are not doing that business. And the result is, some people went to join Bear Stearns, some people went to join Merrill Lynch, some people went to join Lehman Brothers, and boy, did they regret it. So integrity has to be at the heart of what you do, and that was basically the message that came from Jamie, Bill, other senior leadership at JP Morgan at the time. So ultimately it comes down to culture, and that's what matters.
And the converse of integrity, I assume, is like you don't care where the money comes from, you just want the money no matter where it comes from. As, for example, Chelsea fans welcomed Abramovich's billions 20 years ago. Do you think we've really done enough to change that culture and flip over to a situation where we are genuinely concerned if money has come from a dubious origin, or if it's been stolen from a developing country, for example?
So we, broadly defined, no, is the answer, because I don't mind saying this, but I said it on the record in Parliament. The person who has done the most to advance the response to economic crime in the UK in the last 5 years is Vladimir Putin, because it was not until the full-scale invasion in 2022 that legislation that many of us in here, I see Sue from Spotlight over there, people like Sue, Transparency International, others that Oliver was referring to, we'd all been calling for that legislation, for those things to be brought forward, for Companies House to be reformed, all these issues that you've investigated, right? You live off these kinds of issues, but nothing happened. Nothing happened. And then suddenly, in the space of about 2 or 3 weeks, poof, legislation appears. Why did it happen? Because it became intolerable not to bring it forward. And we were constantly told, when parliamentary time allows. If anyone ever says to you, I'll get back to you when parliamentary time allows, that's where good ideas go to die. So I think, there's a huge amount that's happened here in the last 3 to 5 years. We as a community, and we'll hear from Joe Powell, MP, this afternoon, who leads the APPG on anti-corruption and responsible tax. And fundamentally, we need to recognise that the UK, to reflect Oliver's second book, has to become part of the solution, not part of the problem. So the banks can be perfect, but if the leadership, if the law enforcement and everything that goes with that is not also perfect, then we continue to have a problem. And people, many of you will probably know Ambassador Baiba Braza, who was the Latvian ambassador to London when we first started this program. And she used to sit there in the front row, and she's about 2 meters tall. And she would stand up and she would ask the first question always and go, when are you going to clean up London? Right? So until people like Baiba can't ask that question, we all need to do better.
There's a degree of great old British hypocrisy about it sometimes, isn't there? We feel enabled to lecture Ukraine or whoever on corruption, whereas actually we facilitate it, we enable it through what is now a 50-year-old tradition of British offshore structures, etc. What about what's happening now, Tom? Because everyone in this room, you, Oliver, we in the media have worked to try to raise these issues and get people concerned about them. This morning, Trump is just almost throwing that all out the window. He's saying we don't want to go after bribery abroad or people who are going to buy business by giving backhanders to officials, and it will mean lots more business. It's almost an unabashed rejection of any kind of financial integrity. How do you swim against that tide coming out of the White House?
Well, it's very challenging, and I'm sure we're all on kind of email listservs where heads are exploding left and right, and people just aren't sure how to deal with what is going on. I suppose the way we are thinking about it, and it's a very real issue for us because our agenda is set by what's happening around the world. I think the way we're looking at it is, look, there are issues that he cares about, right? He cares about transnational organised crime. That's clear. And we all know that illicit finance or transnational organised crime is a profit-driven or profit-motivated crime. So let's think about how we can engage with those issues. That's not to say that we shouldn't be doing everything we can to point out that issues that are being reversed, like the FCPA or whatever it might be, that's a mistake. But I think we need to engage with the issues that where we can get traction. We've learned an awful lot, for example, over the last 2 or 3 years about maritime sanctions evasion, the Russians using their shadow fleet and so on and so forth. What are the first sanctions that the White House has brought forward in the last month? It's maritime sanctions on Iran. Okay, well, let's take what we've learned on Russia sanctions and make sure that we are prosecuting that as relates to Iran. So I'm not sort of saying, the glass is half full, everything's great, right? But my point is I think there are areas where we can continue to work to demonstrate what we can do. And then at the same time, those who are, if you like, closer to being able to whisper in the president's ear or his advisor's ear, make it clear that it's terribly damaging to do the kinds of things that he's doing. Because, by the way, we know in the UK that being part of the problem, not part of the solution, is just bad for your reputation. And people like Ambassador Braza can stand up and chastise us for it.
So, finally, where would you hope that we would be 5-10 years from now? Having made all this effort, and no sign that you're slacking, what would you like to achieve over the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, we had an event here in the middle of January. One of our senior associate fellows, Matthew Redhair, has written this sort of tome on state threats, and we recorded a podcast about that. And he pointed at the one thing that he really concerned him was the pernicious effect of finance on our democratic process. And if I had to, if you like, stake my life on tackling one issue, that's probably what it is. Because if that collapses, look at what happened in Moldova, right? Very, very nearly an election ended up the wrong way, in my view, and the view of many others, because of the money that flowed into that election. Armenia has got election coming up, which is kind of similarly challenged. We have a colleague in our team from Georgia. Talk to her about what's going on in her country. So I think what I would like to, if you like, be measured against, and our funders always want to see measurement and so on, is what can we do in that sphere? That doesn't mean that the financial crime policy work we do is not important and should continue. We need to continue to press on that. But to me, the issue which is perhaps the most threatening over the next 5 years, or indeed the next few months if you're in Armenia, is how can we make sure that in this country as well, because there's electoral reform that's needed in this country, electoral financial reform that's needed here too, that we are getting our arms around that. Because if that goes, if that can be toppled by money, then we're in trouble. So that's your mission, Andy, at Panorama at the BBC. That's what we should be looking into.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, everybody.